Hello, beautiful people. I am Oliver Perrin for Semiagog, and I am joined today, very happy that it is so, by Apostolic Majesty. And we will be talking about monarchies, real and imagined, under the rubric of the return of the king. So I hope you all will stick around for this entire discussion. I expect it will be a good one. It will be a relaxed one. AM and I have resolved to, on occasion, do some more relaxed streams with a bit less structure, where we just hold forth, if you like, on sort of a basic topic. And this is one that AM certainly knows quite a bit more about than I. And it was there was just some sort of exchange that happened on Twitter with what did AM say? Something like I think legally Evelyn said, "Can we just skip this and go straight to 0 votes?" You know, in reference to some British political thing, and AM responded saying, "Only if the Prince of Liechtenstein lands in Dover to lead the cause of liberation." And I thought to myself, all right, there might be a subject here, because AM has talked in the past about kings and bloodlines and the prospects for all of that, or the lack thereof, in Britain, as well as branches of bloodlines, lineages elsewhere. And I thought, there might be something here. And AM kindly suggested we do it. I'm very happy it is so. Please follow me, Semiagog. You can do it on X or Twitter. You can do it on Telegram. Though we'll see what the prospects for that platform are in future. There's Gab, there's here on YouTube, BitChute, Odyssey, and all of the rest. Before we get into the subject, Apostolic Majesty, could you introduce your excellent channel, which I recommend everyone follow, and shill things that you have going on? I saw that you recently did a stream on Rhodesia.
Yes, as a counter to Semiagog's enthusiasm, I'm going to be bringing the dulcet tones to this stream. So thank you very much for having me on. I did do a stream on Rhodesia 2 days ago, and I will strangely be bringing some tangents from that stream over to today's conversation. As for other content which is related to monarchy, which I've put out there, there's a stream on my channel about the reign of the late Queen Elizabeth II, called Queen of the Ashes. And there was a conversation I had last Christmas with Millennial Woes on Odyssey regarding what my overall impressions on Charles III after a year and a half. And this gives me another opportunity to develop those ideas, because things seem to be going from bad to worse. And my predictions seem to be coming true, unfortunately. But that will just, I think, be a launch pad for this conversation. There is so much we can get into regarding the return of the King of England, or the return of Britain. So yeah, just thank you for having me on.
Yes, and for those who don't know, Apostolic, and I doubt there are many, if any, who are listening, but if you don't know, he has a stream packed with historical reflections, essays, as it were, covering different periods, different aspects, subjects, some of which receive very little attention at all. And one of the great things about the channel, as I always say, is that because of the subject matter, it's not time sensitive in the way that, talking about Prigozhin's putative mutiny in Ukraine and Russia and that sort of thing can be. So definitely head over to Apostolic Majesty's channel on YouTube. Check out, there's lots and lots of stuff there that is very much worth your time. And there is his account on Twitter as well, which seems to be more focused on, opportunities for shit posting. But, you need to have a full range of social expression, including disdain. So, check out both those platforms with him. So the subject is very loose here. It's just the idea of the return of a king. And, there are obviously kings in various places, supposed kings. There's a king of some description in Britain. I'm not qualified to opine on that, really. There's a king in Spain, as I understand it. Hell, there's even a king in a country that I'm not even sure truly exists, called Belgium. So, there are
My
kings.
my
There
my
are.
inner my inner Henri Perrin is screaming at you at the moment. So you got.
Sorry, I see. I shouldn't have jumped into these things I don't know enough about.
Oh no, don't worry, that's a joke.
Well, yeah.
Sorry. I'll elaborate because it seems that no one. Okay, Henri Perrin was a Belgian historian who tried to connect the history of modern Belgium to the ancient duchy of the Burgundies. There were three Burgundies, and there was the Kingdom of Burgundy. And there is actually some historical validity in connecting what is now Belgium to Burgundy, because it was a sequence of dynastic continuity from the House of Valois all the way up to the House of Habsburgs. To me, the problem isn't the fact that Belgium exists, because there's a reason why that territory exists. The problem is that the current dynasty of Belgium was simply just, I don't know, like a lottery handed off to an obscure German dynasty, which also happened to be our ruling dynasty as well, which was the House of Saxe, Coburg and Gotha. But I can understand, because my views on that aren't exactly prolific, that people would be so willing to sort of completely dismiss Belgium. But I'm going off in a different tangent, but hopefully you understand my point.
Yes, indeed. Not being familiar with Perrin, Henri Perrin, I was, of course, I wasn't sure if it was some, surname joke as well. That seemed to have been just another dimension. Yeah, Belgium. Well, yes. So kings. There's so many different ways that we could dig into this. It's an odd thing for an American to even consider, because once upon a time I sneered at the idea of a king. And I remember when I first heard about the so-called dissident right, or alt-right at the time, I was like, what, there are people out there that want a king again? And, I've since had cause to revisit those opinions of mine, if they indeed were really my opinions. And I'm not so sure about them now. That's not to say that I think there are prospects for the return of a sacred king in the immediate future. But it's certainly something worth considering. The point that's often made, at least there is a person that you can conceive of as being responsible, as opposed to this sort of faceless oligarchy that sprouts its pseudopods to do its business, while those who enjoy the fruits of their mastery over us, or worldly mastery in any case, slither about behind the curtain. And there's also a dimension of this that's very, very interesting to me, which is this whole, and I'm sure you're well versed in it, is the whole idea of uniting the sacred and the profane, or the eternal and temporal, however you prefer to express it. There's something in the unifying function of the monarch, which is kind of an echo of God's centralizing and unifying aspects at the top, or at the center of a great chain of being. And there's the business of Christ being divine, and yet in the world, sitting on, I think it's from Luke. I just did a little research beforehand. I'm not claiming that I can quote scripture, but there's this business of he's seated on the throne of David his father, and he will rule over the house of Jacob forever. So you've got this idea of throne and bloodline and house, and you have this idea of course, of a great chain of being. I wrote in the past on it was one of my early publications of mixed value, if I'm honest about it. First thing I ever published, but it was on the Tarocchi of Montaigne, which is a set of what are incorrectly called playing cards. I believe they were associated with the art of memory back in the day. They are a deck of cards, but they were not used for any game that we're aware of today, and they're quite interesting. People can take a look at them in their own time, but basically they're a set that runs from the first card, which is this beggar, misero, this lowest of men. A dog is worrying his ankle. He's supported by this staff, and he's looking sort of with resignation out at the world. And from there, it goes to the servant, the craftsman, the merchant, the gentleman, the knight, the doge, because this deck of cards is from a 15th century Italian context. Then there's the king and the emperor and the pope. And then they move through the 9 muses and Apollo, and then the 7 liberal arts. And then they've got these odd figures of a genius of light and of sun and of time and of the world. And then there's the 7 spheres, sun, moon, the 5 traditional planets. And then they go up to the primum mobile and the prima causa. So you have this very clear layout of this ranking of man and the cosmos and the divine. And each of these aspects has its place in that chain. Most people, of course, who are listening are well familiar with the idea of the great chain of being. But when you think about the loss of a king considered to have a function that bridges between the seen and the unseen, or between heaven and earth, and thereby, through its connection to that top or center or most inward important part, binds it all together and gives it order and imposes that order, like the king's rule. You have the idea of the foot of the king being an indicator of the measurement of a foot, the span or cubit of the king being a standardizing measure, the joint of the thumb being an inch, the stride, one of the king's steps, being a yard. So the standard of measure coming from the king himself, who is the standard of measure. And this goes off in all kinds of directions. You can think about something like Corbusier's modular man, that the buildings should be built to be man-sized and fitting for the affairs of men, and that there must be an archetype of that. And so that gives you ruler, regulate, regulation, all of these concepts of order, and coming from the body and the person of the king himself. There's also this idea of the shattering. When you remove this idea and you substitute it with utilitarianism, pragmatism, secularism, or post-revolutionary French laïcité, the American separation of church and state, all of these things, or all the aspects of this thing under different names. When this comes in, there's this sundering, this splintering of the connection between the worlds, and it results in the splintering of the order of man. And I think we live in that circumstance. There are so many examples. I don't even need to go into them. I mean, we can just refer to cutting off breasts and genitals as one of the fruits of this splintering, or this destruction of this key link at the center. So these are things that come to mind as background for all of this. And you can understand why there's this idea in the Catholic French tradition. I think it goes back to the Book of Miracles, Liber Mirabilis, or Book of Wonders or something, and is doubtless much earlier, this idea that a grand monarch will return. In the days after the French Revolution and after Napoleon, there was this Abbé Souffrant, I can't remember his name, I think that's it, who had his prophecies about a return. There's the idea of Arthur waiting, sleeping, resting, or in repose somewhere to return when he will be needed. There's the extensive and old German there are the extensive and old German traditions of a king asleep in a mountain. And I think all of these ideas and traditions give expression to this human need to have this order, this connection between the seen and the unseen, that has depth and truth, and therefore gives order to human affairs. And so this is the broader background for this subject. That by way of explanation of why it is so interesting to me in certain ways. And with that, with all these different potential points of ingress, I turn it over to you, sir.
It's very interesting. I mean, there's several ways I think this can go. Obviously, I would like to continue along this conceptual route. I think when it comes to like practicalities, I'd like to keep this rather Britain-centric because I think otherwise we'll be talking for about 20 hours. However, regarding your conception of the body, one of the books that very much has inspired my own sort of reading of history in this regard is Ernst Kantorowicz's The King's Two Bodies. You've already mentioned the idea of regulation, the idea of the king's physical features meant to embody some aspect by which things are measured, the yardstick. Within the concept of the king's two bodies, there is the body natural, the king's corporeal form, and there is the body politic, the king as representing the realm, the king as representing the corpus, the body of law, the canon. And you can go further and say that the whole nation becomes the corporation of England. And of course, this is a constitutional concept that Maitland comes up with, and this is late into the 19th and early in the 20th century. So these ideas of monarchy being associated with the body of the people as well. There is a democratic element in the sense that the monarch is supposed to be the incarnation of a people, of possessing a land and representing a realm, a state, and representing a body of laws, but also representing a mystical body, a body which is transcendent above all of these things and enters into a secret communion with a higher power. In the case of Catholicism, whatever the examples you brought up, we're talking about the idea of Christian vice-regency, divine right monarchy, all of these things that not just sanctify the individual, but sanctify the office, the state, and indeed the entire realm. They, like entering into the Catholic Church, almost allow for the whole state to be legitimized, because to be allied to the king, to be loyal to him, is in a sense godly. It is in a sense subjugation towards Christ, who is king above all, in the sense that all of these kings are their vice-regents. So you bring all of that up, and then there is another aspect that Kantorowicz brings up regarding his reading of Richard II, which is the idea of usurpation. How can a society or a nation cope when all of these things, which this really is what should be meant by integralism. Integralism in like Catholic political parlance really is a very nebulous concept. But when I look at Christian monarchy and monarchy is conceived of as ethnarchy, as representing the nation, I very much see this as the absolute form of integralism, the ultimate form of integralism. So when someone who is supposed to represent the body natural and the body politic can no longer claim to represent the latter, moreover cannot claim to represent the mystical body, and we have the idea of usurpation, then we come back to the ideas you brought up regarding the king under the mountain, or the fact that you see the prophecies after the fall of Louis XVI and the various monarchical incarnations that you see afterwards about what is the true corporation of France. Is it represented under the Bourbons, under the Orleanists, under the Bonapartes, or should we go for something else? All of these things are fundamentally interesting because it's the crisis that is facing Britain today, and you term this Return of the King, and it may come as a surprise for people listening to this who, of course, know that we do technically have a king in this country. But I believe the topic, Return of the King, is more pertinent for Britain in many senses than it is for many other places in the world. Recently, we've had an election in this country, and many of sort of people you and I know, including myself, were advocating for the complete implosion of the Conservative Party for various reasons. The people who were sort of, I would say, more intelligent and should have known better, like David Starkey and Peter Hitchens, one as a historian and one as a journalist, are attached to what I can only refer to as a form of institutional fetishism. This, you can say, is the ultimate sort of regressive form of high Toryism. Despite the institutions representing nothing, the fact that the institutions wear the skin suits should be enough to venerate, to enable a sort of form of veneration. And the crux of these sort of neo-Burkean argumentations, I see it as a perversion of Catholicism. It is apostolic succession and sacred tradition misapplied to the secular world. You can say that this form of ideological sort of institutional fetishism is idolatry, as if Christ was present in the Constitution. And I'm not just using this to refer to Britain, I'm also using that to refer to America as well. And I think perhaps you can see that there is some validity in trying to understand, especially Republican commentators, as if the Christ hosts were present in the Constitution. Because ultimately, the Constitution is just a piece of paper. The Constitution represents the zeitgeist of a group of politicians back in the 1770s up to the 1790s, with subsequent revisions and additions and subversions to represent political developments since then. And yet, the whole basis of this neo-Burkean sort of golden bull idolatry is to look at these things and assume a mystical body politic, a corporation inherent in these sort of things. Would you say in the American case that was applicable?
Yes, most certainly. I mean, I've often wondered whether it goes back to this fundamental idea of sacred text, but the way in which these documents are venerated, the idea of, great charters of any kind, codes of laws coming from a divine king, the idea that the word of God is embodied and stays. This whole idea of anything staying is the basis of culture. When you think about any point of orientation, whenever I hear the word stay or stand or stead or steady, for that matter, I think about the raising of a column. So you can think about Solon's laws, apparently on these rotating wooden cylinders, the Code of Hammurabi, or raising an obelisk. The obelisk is a good one, as I talked about in the past, because you have the idea it's a gnomon. So it's essentially like a giant gnomon for a sundial. And as I learned living in the East, you can also look at them as a reference against the stars on a clear night. So the idea that you have this central object that has been raised, that stays, and stay and stead etymologically are the roots of institution, the placing of something that stands. I think about these physical objects, but the text, particularly with the religions of the books, begins to perform that function, and it is venerated similarly as something that is a vessel for social organization. But it's unfortunately, when you get into the letters and the words, then you get into hermeneutics, you get into pilpul, you get into the connivances of lawyers, and the ability to to twist the text to be whatever it is that you want it to mean. I realize that's a kind of a sprawling reply, but there's something of the text as a thing that is supposed to stand, but because of its nature, it's much less simple than a raised column around which a community organizes. It becomes a point of ingress for every type of textual interpretation. We could even get involved in gematria with it, for fuck's sake. Historically, much of that has gone on.
Well, I mean, just to sort of compound what you're saying, and there's so much you said there that one can latch on to. The reason I bring up the Catholic example is because, again, just look at it this way in terms of looking at constitutions in general. See them as a form of consecration, as a form of transubstantiation. The priest says the words, the Eucharist occurs, the body and blood is formed out of the bread and the wine, and then the host is placed in a monstrance, and then it becomes sacred, placed there for everyone to see. Constitutions in many ways can be interpreted that way because the sacred words uttered, the creation of the corpus of the law, the words being the words of God, all of these things you can say are bestowed upon these things. And when you look at constitutions, they are bestowed. They are bestowed by monarchs. What would the validity essentially of Magna Carta have if Magna Carta wasn't bestowed by a monarch, which everyone seems to forget? John, you may say, oh, the barons imposed this treaty on him at Runnymede, but ultimately the source of legitimacy and the mystical elements of the British Constitution were bequeathed by a king, which in turn represented that form of vice-regency. I mean, you brought in the example of Hammurabi, which is very prescient because I was about to come up with the exact same example. But just take the example of the monstrance. One person says it's transubstantiation. It is the literal body, and in that case, it's sacred. That sort of goes beyond just textual interpretation into the realms of all interpretation, whether it be an image, whether it be an icon, or any sort of form of representation, because transubstantiation then becomes a matter of interpretation. Is it the literal body of God, or is it simply meant to signify the body of God? Is there a corporeal presence, or is there simply a psychic presence of God represented in the body? To what extent should we treat this concept seriously at all? Or should we eschew the concept anyway? Within a society in which you can say transubstantiation is readily believed, to take the monstrance and to desecrate the Christ host is an immediate act of self-excommunication. You have broken away from the body politic, you have broken away from the corporation, and so you are cast out automatically. However, if you begin to interpret what the host means and what significance we should assign to that, then we arrive in the position where infinite revisions are completely permissible. And then why shouldn't we go further? Why shouldn't we destroy the monstrance? Why shouldn't we destroy the Christ host and do away with it and create something entirely different? At which point, the texts and constitutions simply become nothing more than extensions of hard power with no mystical quality added to them, to the point that constitutions become complete and utter farce. And I bring up all of these concepts again because it's all about an element of that mystical relationship and that sense of being part of a community, being part of a national congregation, all facing towards the altar and all believing in the real presence, believing that this has legitimacy and that this is approved of by a divinely ordained authority, which is the case of the king. So I come back to my 0 seats comparison and say the reason that this is so significant is because in the way that I was advocating for the complete and utter destruction of the Tory party, because it represents this form of idolatry. Seeing the Tory party for me it generates the same sort of reaction that Leo the Isaurian would see for a icon in the 8th century. I think this should be applied to the entire British state and the British monarchy. And the reason I say that is because, and the reason I think this is important in terms of understanding this whole notion of return of the king, is that the British monarchy is a form of idolatry. It doesn't represent any of these things that I'm mentioning. It doesn't represent a mystical element anymore. It doesn't represent a body that possesses the land. It doesn't represent the body that represents the demos, the people. There isn't that democratic element, and I use it in its purest sense, not the sense where it becomes sort of transcendently sort of superimposed into the realm of infinite abstraction, which that is what democracy is now. I'm talking about it as it really should exist. So once the monarchy has divested all of these things, essentially the monarch becomes as useful to us as the Conservative Party does. Because these mystical bodies, the two bodies of kingship, the corporation, all of these things are the essence of monarchy, and take that away, we now pine for a return. And the reason why usurpation is so terrible is that it creates a spiritual as well as a political chasm. You know, we as a nation, and nations all across the world, are set adrift. The whole notion of sacred tradition, of continuity, of a regal form of apostolic succession is broken. And that is why I am so depressed by the state of quality in Britain. I really want to substantiate why I believe this. Recently, the king gave not just a nod of approval, but basically a writ of approval for the way in which the police have been treating what are effectively now almost, considered by a majority of commentators to be political prisoners in this country. The Queen never did that to that extent. There may have been intimations, but never to that extent. So ultimately, what the monarch in this country has become is nothing more than an ornament justifying government policy, but government itself is completely divested from representing any interest or idea of union with the body politic, with the people. In the way, I would also say that the idea of the king representing the body politic is actually alive and well in the most perverse sense of that word, because I believe if he is the incarnation of the institutions in the state, then his approval actually gives warrant to all of these ideas. His ideas are trickling down into all of the organs of the state in the same way that he is an advocate for globalism. He is an advocate for not just environmentalism, but you can say wealth redistribution as well. All of these things. And so when thinking about this, I do feel that for all intents and purposes, the monarch has already excommunicated himself from that position. In the same way that a bishop can be excommunicated essentially by heresy, and even popes can be deposed if they commit absolute heresy, because all of these things represent the body. They represent tradition. But now you're in a position essentially where you have to cut off the head, and the body is, writhing on the ground, and the spirit has become dispossessed and now needs to find a new host. So that is the situation we're in. So from that, how do you find a new king? How do we create the conditions for a return of the king? How can we even conceive of this idea, given that is the predicament we find ourselves in?
Yeah, very good question indeed. I had long thought that a safer approach, there's a line in a particular translation of the Tao or Tao that I rather like. It says, though tight the net of words may bind, how surely truth slips out. It doesn't matter how far you delve into precisely aligning each jot and tittle, simply because there is what words can do, and then there's what words fail to do because of their multivalence, the ambiguity, all the various things that transformers of texts rely upon in order to work their cunning magic. So I'd long thought that there was this other domain, hence semiagog, semiotics, the idea of objects. We're looking into etymology in order to determine the objects to which the words once referred. You mentioned canon earlier, and I'm sure it was no accident on your part. I just pulled up the etymology of that when we were talking about kings and rulership and regulation. Canon, goes back, of course, as you and many listeners know, to church law, a rule or doctrine enacted by ecclesiastical authority. But it goes back to measuring line or rule, from Greek kanon, any straight rod or bar, rule, standard of excellence, perhaps from kana, reed, which, gives us a cane. So I guess what I'm getting at there, I'm sorry, it's not very clear, is that if you return to the objects rather than the words, it doesn't matter what anyone is saying if they've raised a fist against you, because, they can speak all these words of joy and future states that we must sacrifice today in order to bring about, but they've got a raised fist, and I know what that means. And so I had long thought that rituals related to timeless objects would be a way out of this. And I guess here I'm sort of going in the direction of something latent in what you brought up about the body. The land and the king are one. I guess we're going to get into that as well at some point. But there's the corpus, the community of the nation, those who share birth, natal, congenital, all this kind of stuff. Those who share the culture and the place and the blood, who rightfully should be ruled over by their king, they have certain obligations of their own, insofar as they must remain capable of comprehending the meaning of these objects. And I've been all over the place with this. In order to anchor it, I should say I have in mind rituals of related to the making of a king. And when you think about that, we think about the crown today. The most important thing about the rituals of kingship is that it's more about a band, which etymologically goes back to like a band of men, like seated around a round table, as it were. It goes back to the wearing of a ring, the circle, the crown being a circle, the ring being a circle, them being made of metal, perhaps of noble metals, to signify their importance and their value. But of course, the old Roman rings were made of iron in the days of the Republic, and they represented bonds that formed bands, and that certainly were binding as law. And we can see that all across traction systems and harnesses and the rest. If anyone who's dealt with horses knows the importance of a ring that serves to bring all these straps together, as well as the strap itself being buckled to form a ring. And so coming back to this idea of remaining aware, our responsibility to remain aware of the meaning of these rituals that are expressed prior to and beyond language. We are, I hate to use the word illiterate because it goes back to text, but it's the only word we have, or that comes to mind for me immediately, to describe this sense that we should remain able to interpret accurately the meaning of the symbols and the images before us. And we've forgotten this whole idea of the obligation of the king. And once upon a time, rituals of kingship focused not on the crowning, but on belting, in recognition of one's obligations. And that is the girdle. But the girdle is also the garth, the garden. All these words are directly related. To be belted as king, and that belt would also carry a sword, which is the ability to say yes and no, not this idea that there's endless tolerance. Without the ability to say no to something, you cannot perform your function as king. You cannot cut and sever and shape. And so we've forgotten this idea of the belting of the king, which is the girdle, which creates the garden, within which those who are the subjects of the king are kept safe. And they are thereby wards, because they're guarded. And hence the idea of warden and garden and guard and garden and girth and girdle, they're all tied together. And these images are things that we have forgotten. And so this was all quite a bit too long-winded, but the idea is, or rather what I turn over to you for your consideration is, what are the obligations of the people relative to their king? So much has been made of the idea, that the king should be struck down, the head should be cut off, a tisket, a tasket, a head in a basket. It cannot respond to questions that you ask it. We've got this mob conception. But once upon a time, what were the obligations of the people to their king?
Well, there are a lot of points I actually want to sort of add on to, if that's okay, in addition to answering your question. Just to hammer home how much I agree with you regarding general illiteracy, which is why I find the situation in the UK at the moment so utterly insufferable, is because everyone wallows in a sort of perpetual sort of sea in ignorance. The Pyrrhian spring has well and truly welled up when it comes to knowledge of such concepts. Even legal scholars and constitutionalists seem to have lost all interest in the topic whatsoever for the last 80 or so years. But just to enumerate some points regarding relaying this back to tangible examples when it comes to history in Britain, you bring up the banding and you bring up the belting. And regarding the idea of the band, of course, when you look at early Roman statesmen and during the Republic, the idea of the crown never really came into the fore in the whole idea of Roman monarchy, even when the princeps transitioned into the dominus. The idea again was always focused on the ring. And indeed, you can almost say in terms of the rungs of the toga, the garment. But just emphasizing the ring, as you correctly associate, the signet ring, the ring of the fisherman, the band, the bond essentially between the king and his bondsman, the subject. But also, it is a symbol of marriage. It's therefore no mystery to us that Elizabeth, to justify her perpetual virginity as monarch over England, held up her ring to say, I am married to England. So it's not just a matter of reciprocal obligations and to be kindred to your people, but it's also an explicit amount of benevolence. It is the idea of love of your people. I'm always reminded of Elizabeth when she was speaking to the Parliament on the topic of the abolition of state-granted monopolies to aristocrats. And she said that there had been many greater and wiser kings who have sat on this chair, but none who have loved you better. So to her, the idea of the ring as signifying that, again, was a core component of monarchy. The bonding, the kindredness, the loyalty, the idea of raising the sword, but also the idea of benevolence and love. And this is corrupted, again, going back to the same roots of this idea, in the form of King Solomon. Because in the form of King Solomon, the ring, which also represents all of that, becomes a symbol of domination. It becomes a symbol of corruption. So here we see the transition, you can say, in terms of all of the implications of these symbols, that yes, they are supposed to represent this in the same way that the ring of the fisherman is supposed to represent the office and also represent continuity, but it can also represent corruption and domination. But there is another aspect, a very important aspect, which you left out, which is the idea of the ritual anointing. In the Christian ceremony, it is not the bonding, it is not the coronation itself, the crowning. It is the anointing that makes the sovereign, because that is what makes the sovereign enter into this mystical association. You can say, I don't think it's actually controversial to say that when you are anointed, it is sacramental. You are not just becoming a sovereign, a vice regent, and representing all of these things regarding kindredness to your people and reciprocal obligations, but you're also becoming a priest as well, a high priest of a nation. And that's another thing I want to get back into in terms of relaying all of these concepts and trying to understand why this mystical body of monarchy has been set adrift when it comes to all of these things. It is not just a political, a ethnic, a territorial consideration. It is a ideological and religious consideration as well. All of these things amalgamating in the one person, hence the idea I posited here of monarchy representing the ultimate form, and indeed I believe you can almost say the only valid form of integralism. So what you do in the case of usurpation, which is the vein of what we're talking about today, which is the return of the king, not simply explaining the righteous and obviously sort of true example of monarchy we have in this country, which is this idea of the deposition, the removal of the head. In the case of the French revolutionaries, they looked upon someone like King Louis XVI as representing some form of foreign authority. From the point of view of the views of the Enlightenment, this was directed towards the Catholic Church. But this was also, I think, when in terms of appealing to Republican supporters in the larger sort of body of France, not just the intelligentsia, this appealed to something much deeper, which was a sense of ethnic animosity directed towards the monarch in France, because France, in many ways, was an imposition over Gaul, two nations representing roughly the same territorial base. And so the move towards deposing the king was a means essentially of, for lack of a better word, in terms of Gallicizing France, returning it to that sense of kindred relationship with the people. And of course, what did Louis XVI do to completely justify that view? That the king represented an other, in addition to the king not representing the new religion of the revolutionaries, which was the Catechism of Rousseau. The king fled, tried to flee to what was then the Austrian Netherlands in his flight to Varennes to appeal to his relatives. So from the French revolutionary perspective, they had their entire conception justified of the king as representing another. But they didn't immediately kill him. They tried to bring him kicking and screaming into allegiance with the French people. And they did this by declaring war on the country he had just tried to escape to. Then, of course, what does that country do? Austria and Prussia, etc., the coalition forces. They send an edict demanding that the French people don't harm their king. What does this obviously do? Creates an even greater, palpable, frenzied sense of otherness towards the monarch. And so the monarch is decapitated. The body is broken. And then a king must arise to represent, you can say, the true aspirations of the return to kingship. So it's interesting how you bring up the examples, the prophecies of the return of the king. Well, I believe that many Frenchmen were already feeling this sense that I'm feeling at the moment, which is this feeling of usurpation and loss and wanting to bring it back, essentially. And you can say that that is why Bonaparte had such a seductive influence, because in many senses he represented this. And of course, this isn't just an example in terms of someone who literally holds the title of monarch, king, emperor of France, but it can refer to anyone who basically tries to derive absolute power based on a vested providential will of the demos. I'm sure you can infer various examples from what I'm bringing up. So, and of course, I believe this is actually part of the reason why, with Rousseau, there is such an emphasis on the return to nature, the idea that man is free, but everywhere he is bound in chains. Because what was once the sacred continuity, those traditions, that which was essentially meant to bind a nation together, it was the essence of the corporation, found in integralism focused around the monarch. But all of a sudden, these things were now strangling the corporation. you can say, trying to find some sort of biological equivalent, this is, your very veins constricting you, trying to suffocate you and kill you. And so the institutions become the chains. We have to revert back to an idealized, ancient, pre-institutionalized state of being, and we need to begin again. And that fundamentally, you can say, represents a psychic aspect of this mystical usurpation when the body is broken. And so the way to justify that from the point of view of the revolutionary is to remove the head and see if a new body can essentially, a mystical subject essentially can present themselves through providence. And many such examples have essentially been proffered through by history. So hopefully I've answered your question.
Well, you certainly raised any number of further points, and the first thing that comes to mind with the idea that these metaphors that seem to work well together, you've got binding, but that binding can become a noose, and you've got the idea of rings and belts, and as I mentioned earlier, you have the idea of traction systems. And they are necessary if you want to use animal energy to achieve anything. It's fundamental to the idea of the chevalier, the man who is atop the horse, who rides the horse. And you've got the idea of his lower nature that is dominated by the figure of the cavalier, the rider, Ritter. All this metaphorical idea of the aristocrat as a rider is deep in the West, and it's the idea that you can control the beast to your benefit and to everyone's benefit. But the key to that is the harness. Without a saddle, without stirrups, without a bridle, things that in their turn developed over the years, it's very difficult to control a horse. You can seize it by the mane, but it becomes difficult to do anything while you're mounted atop it other than stay mounted until you introduce these various traction system innovations. They're also what allow people to use that force of these beasts or these lower orders of animals in the great chain of being to perform work. They have to be harnessed together, and they have to pull together. Otherwise you've got two jackasses pulling in opposite directions and tearing apart whatever is there in between, which makes me think that drawing and quartering has a deeper sense of the sin itself being its own punishment, in the sense you'd be torn apart by horses going in different directions, because that's what the chaos you have brought into the realm causes.
Yes,
and you yourself should be subject to it.
I mean, the chain that binds, the great chain of being, all of these things you can say again are metaphors for what I'm trying to get across with the idea of integralism. And you're completely right when it comes to the idea of the quartering, because the quartering was conceived of exactly like that by King Edward I. And of course, what crime was it designated for? It was designated for treason. So the quartering was the punishment for discord used to disrupt that corporation, which is representing of the kingdom, which of course in the case of Edward I was England. And thereby it's no surprise that, just going over Dante as I have recently, which, trucks in the audience, much rather hear me talk about 20th century history than talk about the intricacies of Dante. That is the sin which Dante confers upon the traitors who have brought about discord. Exactly what you are mentioning. So it's not just a physical punishment, but it is a fixed position, a fixed punishment in hell for the cause of discord invited by treason. That is the severity of it, to remain perpetually dismembered as a result of you shattering the mystical body of kingship. And thereby you can perhaps see why the removal of the head, the severing of the body, is such a necessary image in terms of understanding the elimination of these other symbols, which are supposed to represent the unity of the body.
Yeah, there's much to dig into there with the idea, which for my part, I feel is central to Dante, which is this idea that what is witnessed in hell is the condition of the soul in eternity, as a reflection of what it is on earth when it is behaving in the way that it is. So it's both, it can be considered sequentially, do this and these will be the fruits. But it can be from the perspective of eternity. It is what your soul is as you are, as you do and be these things. And so, we have the whole potential subject of, why we are suffering and how we are suffering, what we are today, sin being the condition of its own, the condition of sin itself being its own punishment. That's a whole other angle. I'm not sure if it fits in well enough to track it down to its other destinations or track it forward from its sources. But it does bring to mind this sense that we are suffering the fruits of our own behaviors. And it is this horror where we're literally cutting away the parts of our bodies that create, anyway, that's a freakish thing that probably doesn't bear too much consideration. To come back around to,
well, just one point before you move on, because there is something that bears consideration. As the physical body is torn apart, the state of sin, suffering, and eternity is a eternal punishment, and that is an indictment on the morals of the individual, and that is the situation of the soul put in the context of the church and Christianity. But the actual death blow delivered to the body in life is in turn representative of the nature of the temporal body politic. Yes, the sin and what the sin represents will be eternally fixed in hell, but as everything in the afterlife is meant to essentially be imitated to some extent on earth, yes, the criminal will die, but also the body politic will die. The nation can die because it is of this world and not of the other world. So I think it's actually quite pertinent to bring up that distinction between those two things.
Yeah, which perhaps brings us to a further aspect that I would certainly like to hear your thoughts on, and maybe that leads us further into this, or leads us properly to this idea of Arthur. But there's the land and the king are one. This idea that the monarch, when he is ill, the land is ill, and when the land is ill, the monarch is ill, because there is this mystical relationship between both those things, because in their heart, both these things are one.
Regarding the land, I mean, that's not something which comes across explicitly. It comes across a lot in terms of sort of literary associations, but in terms of a political formula, I don't really want to dwell on this point too much, but just as you bring it up, it's that whole idea is explicitly built into the foundations of filial piety and the mandate of heaven within China, that natural disasters occurring to the land, the damage to the land itself, which seem to be beyond the powers of the body politic, are instead representative of that lack of legitimacy. Just an interesting note. But I do bring it up because I do believe it bears relevance on this idea of the physical land as representing part of the body, because it forms part of this overall sort of philosophical structure we're outlining.
Yeah, and I just thought about the idea of the Fisher King, and I just pulled it up because I wanted to look at where the wound was on the Fisher King, and it's interesting that one of the versions, at least one of the versions, is this idea of being wounded in the groin, in the generative organs, and that once again just parallels the idea that we express our spiritual condition often unknowingly in our acts and behaviors. And, once again, this idea of cutting the generative and secondary sexual organs off of children, the way in which everything that confronts us in our lives is, in some sense, some deep and mystical sense, a metaphor, is striking. But so where does returning to British kings more specifically, rather than this more general idea of kingship, although the idea of Arthur, I think, is a bridge between both of these things, a rather appropriate ligature. What are we to make of this idea of Arthur and this sort of fundamental British myth, to whatever extent it's not historical? What are we to make of that? What lessons can we take from that as regards this idea of a return of a king?
Well, there are many elements that I'm going to draw out here, less focused on the historicity of Arthur itself, because I think the historicity of Arthur is one of the most irrelevant aspects of all of this. What Arthur really was in history is less important than what he can be identified with as part of a conceptual historical trajectory. That may be pretentious, but I'll get into what I essentially mean by that. So the first thing to point out is relating to this idea of cutting, because I want to continue off in the vein that you brought on the damage done to the body and that damage being replicated in the body politic. And that is represented by the damage and possible slaying of Arthur and him retreating to Avalon, either for his death or for a period of convalescence. And thereby, essentially, we have the idea, is the corporation dead? Or is the corporation merely recuperating, convalescing until its return? Within the whole scheme of British English history, this is very important because Arthur, in terms of the chronology that we have around the sort of 5th and the 6th century, represents this period of transition between the Romano-British and the Saxons, i.e., what even represents the people and the land is being radically transfigured before our eyes. And invariably, once you have one of these archetypes, these Arthurian archetypes, they represent some form of resistance to this radical transition, whether it be invasion or demographic transformation, which was doubly the case when it came to the Saxons. But this is also replicated when you come to King Alfred the Great and his standing up against the great heathen army, which represented the Vikings, and then finally what essentially represented the anti-kingdom in Britain, which was the Danelaw. And the point of resisting that and restoring the kingdom was to establish the dominion of England, not just in conquering the Danes, but also in terms of projecting authority throughout the entire land. And there we come to this idea of imperium, of sovereignty. And I was thinking for another subject, but it sort of comes to an interesting point here in terms of looking at Arthur and what he represents and all of the other sort of facets, because the other figures I really bring up here, which I think are relevant, are King Henry VIII and Elizabeth, because if we're going to look at Spain historically and say that Spain represents piety, France represents grandeur, and what can you say about Russia? It probably represents endurance, if nothing else. To me, what England, Britain represents is sovereignty. And so King Alfred was resisting invasion, and his successor, Athelstan, was asserting sovereignty, dominion, imperium over the Isles. It's no surprise that whilst we have Aeneas being the founder of the Kingdom of Alba Longa, which is the precursor to the foundation of the city of Rome, that Brutus, also from Troy, comes and founds the British civilization, hence Brutus, Brutia, British, because there is that imperial connection. to have dominion over these isles. And of course, the prescient sort of note that Brutus then becomes dominion over the largest empire in world history. But this idea again of sovereignty, resisting the invader, having to cope with massive systemic transfigurations and change, and the implications of legitimacy. This comes back to the Norman conquest, where Harold Godwinson was killed, and there was a almost total process of expropriation directed at then the English people and the English aristocracy as a result of the Norman conquest and the harrowing of the North. Then we have
Yeah,
this.
and the Doomsday Book, most famously embodying
Yes,
that. Yep.
and yes, you can say the Doomsday book is this great corpus of law. You can say it represents a new radical redefinition of the body, because the territory and the people had been disenfranchised, and now the body politic, the king's authority, is being represented by a foreigner through the imposition of text, in terms of, and everything that sort of represents in terms of the authority stemming from the Code of Hammurabi and all of those sort of things. It's interesting, isn't it, that in terms of emphasizing sovereignty, I hearken it back to this idea of the Norman yoke and William choosing to rule the domain from Normandy, and his first son being given Normandy as more important than the possession of England itself, which was given to William Rufus. But this idea of this contest of sovereignty appears again and again. I mean, Walter Scott, I believe, tried and failed to make Richard the Lionheart, the Coeur de Lion, into some sort of Arthurian archetype, because there is very little of England represented in Richard the Lionheart beyond the idea of the crusading concept. He was very much conceived of as a ruler in Aquitaine, and for what sort of period of government he did sort of exert, it was very much in France, and he was buried alongside his father, Henry II, in Angers. So all of this is essentially to represent all of these things I'm pointing out, which is the complicated nature of what is the legitimate representation of the body of kingship. And I feel that, as with England having to fight off against the Danes and assert sovereignty over the island, the whole Norman and later Plantagenet infatuation in terms of trying to understand this represents a complication and a diminution of English sovereignty. You can point to some sort of salient political advice that, the way to avoid domestic troubles at home is to become embroiled in foreign quarrels, which was the case with Henry V after the usurpation by his father against Richard II. I bring Richard II up also because, of course, Richard II is why I put so much emphasis on this idea of the body mystical being usurped, and what is the ultimate source of authority from which the king's power can derive. In the case of someone like Henry IV, it really seemed to be a point of political expediency, if nothing else. But with Henry V, you can say, from the point of view of English sovereignty, it was actually a blessing that Henry V's project failed. He failed to create a lasting personal union with France, because I'm always reminded of the words of Abbé Suger, who was the fundamental in terms of really understanding the sort of religious iconography of France in the 11th and 12th century, which is the idea of France almost taking the mantle of the most sacred kingdom away from the Holy Roman Empire, and France is representing the eldest daughter of the church, and France and its history in many ways almost representing a series of false starts. But I also come back to this idea of the destiny of France as dominion over England and not contrariwise. Yes, Henry V may have conquered France as King of England, but I do believe, kind of like what we see with when James I of Scotland became King of England, it would have represented the English conquest of Scotland as much as it would have represented the French conquest of England. So in sparing that, we come back to the Arthurian idea. And isn't it interesting that there are so many prophecies of the revival of the Red Dragon the red dragon, which is to represent the Brythonic peoples, the Arthurian legacy, defeating the white dragon, which is to represent England. And then you have this idea of the king coming out of Wales, which is the case of Henry VII, the Duke of Richmond, the man who was the descendant of a Welsh chamber servant who was able to seduce the widowed queen of Henry V, Catherine de Valois. Yes, that may have been the weird set of circumstances which allowed this prophecy to come to fruition, but it was incredibly important in terms of basically establishing this Brythonic English connection focused on sovereignty over the Isles, of reasserting this idea of explicit Arthurian kingship within England, the restoration of the body politic, and this, ironically, coming about as a result of the technical usurpation of power away from King Richard II, the last Plantagenet king, who was slain in battle at the Battle of Bosworth Field. So on the one hand, you can say that the Norman conquest represents the Norman yoke, and you can say that from a ideological and philosophical point of view, in terms of understanding this, in terms of the grander narratives of the return of Arthur from Avalon, that the deposition of Richard III and the deposition of the Plantagenet dynasty represents some form of Arthurian restoration or renaissance. So it's no wonder then that the Prince of Wales, again, emphasis on Wales, his son would bear the name Arthur. And it's only by a sad twist of fate that the King of England wouldn't bear the name Arthur, but would bear the name Henry. But that was very much the legacy that Henry VII essentially wanted to impose. And of course, the irony of all of this is that Henry VII was a very small, paranoid individual who imagined himself to be the great chivalric, heroic archetype as seen in the epics of Geoffrey of Monmouth and the Matter of Britain. But in reality, he was this managerial, penny-pinching, rather sort of, you can say tyrannical, even king. And so what frustration there was directed at Henry VII was supposed to be realized in Henry VIII, and it was. It was indirectly. Because Henry VIII was able to achieve something which Henry VII had failed to achieve, which is further going on from this idea of the return of Arthur, the king out of Wales. We arrive at the idea of the restoration of the English church. The creation of the Church of England wasn't perceived as a breakaway from Rome, but it was seen as a restoration of royal power over the church within England. I'm saying this objectively. I'm not saying this from the point of view of a Catholic. And so if you were to apply this to like Orthodox examples, the word they come up with is autocephaly, the restoration or the rule of the head as representing the mystical body of kingship. And again, the idea that comes forth in the ideas of the arguments back and forth over the act of uniformity, that the priest and the individual cannot be loyal to two masters, in this case directed at the Holy Father, the Pope, and directed at the monarch. And you brought up earlier on the idea of Apollo, which is, again, rather prescient because, of course, Apollo is radiance. He is the sun. And when we look at someone like Louis XIV, why does he focus so much on Apollo? Because he is a great advocate for Gallicanism, which is as far as autocephaly goes, while still being a member technically of the Catholic Church. He is not the moon, being essentially where his radiance comes from the light of the sun, which is invested in spiritual power, which is inherent in the Pope. But he himself is priest. He is that spiritual power, and he is the radiance from which essentially the nation can be illuminated, from which the crops can grow and people can go about their lives and work. The very essence, you can say, of the body politic, the land, the spirit, the religion, the ideology, all of these things interconnected. The Apollonian example of Louis XIV and the idea of Henry VIII as restoring autocephaly, establishing himself not just as King of England, but the supreme governor over the church. And we have the idea then of the Little Englander. And Elizabeth, the daughter who he didn't want, the daughter who was declared a bastard so many times, the daughter who was actually disinherited not by her Catholic sister, but by her Protestant brother in favor of Lady Jane Grey. Despite all of this, she became you can say almost the perfect representation of all of these things that I'm trying to bring up in terms of the legacy of English monarchy at its heart being Tudor in all of these sort of things. And the great sort of tragic irony of this emphasis I'm bringing up on autocephaly of the prophesied monarch from Wales is that King Charles I tried to achieve all of these things. He tried to reassert the authority of the king. He tried to reconnect people to the Church of England with himself as its autocephalous head. And how did the people treat him over that? They ended up taking off his head as well. And so there are many sort of interpretations you can essentially bring back and forth, but all of this is to say that I can draw from all of these various historical examples something which is not just religiously or sort of philosophically tangible, but actually historically contingent. There is a continuity here. And in the case of England, there are many breaks with it which represent this form of usurpation again and again and again, whether it be the creation of the Danelaw, whether it be the Norman conquest and the establishment of the Norman yoke, whether it be the deposition and the regicide of King Charles I, and of course, the Dutch coup in 1688, which is not just a usurpation, but it represents the importation, you can say, of a foreign Dutch mercantilism, which is also one of the reasons why I believe that Cromwell was not, the great man either, because in his pursuit of empire overseas, he also was a forerunner to this as well. And so in all of these things, you have a disfigured sense of monarchy that comes after the Tudor sort of archetype, which is a representative of the Arthurian archetype. And so in trying to understand our predicament now, you really need to get rid of what would essentially be the spiritual equivalent of France, i.e., our obsession with investment in foreign quarrels. You need to detach the monarchy from all of these spurious possessions abroad, which weaken that kindred ethnic conception of the monarchy, relaying back to whether it be Sir Dick of Wessex or Arthur himself or Alfred the Great or any of these sort of things. In the case of Britain's position today, this could be represented in neocon wars, but I also very much believe that this is the association with the Commonwealth, because the Commonwealth, as far as I can see it, is a form of foreign dominion over this country, as many people may find that bizarre to think. The Commonwealth is not some sort of emanation of British power, but it is essentially a possession, a organization, an NGO of the king, which is of more interest to him, i.e. being kindred to people who are not represented by the bond which is represented in the ring, which represents the bondsman and the subjectum. But under the Commonwealth, the subjectum no longer exists. The king is bound to everyone. And of course, as you know, with marriage, you cannot be married to everyone. If you are married to everyone, you are married to no one. There is no sacramental quality here. There is no desire to form a union and to propagate and to protect and to bring one up in the idea of communion with the church or the mystical body of kingship, all of these things. If there's no possession of land, if there's no realm, if there's no people, there is no monarchy. And so if you take all of the examples and apply it to the situation we have now, all of the importation of these foreign concepts are now literal foreigners. And this foreign imposition we have over us in terms of what the king is ultimately for. When the king comes around and supports what the government is currently doing, the government which basically sees a foundational rot which is eroding a path to progressive modernism, which is to see Britain as some sort of accelerated vehicle towards the new sort of future we have ahead of us, when the monarchy becomes allied to that, and when it becomes part of an institution which is antithetical to everything that I'm trying to outline, then how can you not look at this and say that the king is almost the white dragon that needs to be slain, and the red dragon out of Wales, Avalon, Arthur, the restoration of the body politic? As with all of these things and temporal considerations, the nation, Britain, England might die. But as we see with these many examples of restoration, it is possible that it may be saved.
The king is dead, long live the king, right?
Mm.
That sort of thing. At that point of transition, there are several angles to this, and since we're allowed to have a sprawling conversation, because this is not some strictly laid out discussion, perhaps you'll indulge me, or perhaps you have some thoughts to share on mercantilism. You know, I've there's a joke I often tell, and I'll just tell it again. I just thought it was funny as hell when I first heard it. I can't remember who I heard it from. There was, but it goes like this. It's basically that the Dutch and the English are exactly the same, except that with the Dutch, you actually get what you pay for. And I don't know, that reflects some deep-seated rivalry between the Dutch and the English. But there are several. How do I set this forth? You know, you mentioned this interesting thing about Richard the Lionhearted as an archetypal figure, preferred by Scott. You know, as some sort of national figure brought down to date. And you mentioned, you know, his involvement in foreign wars and the fact that he's, you know, buried in France. And, you know, you have the idea of the Doomsday Book, which I always think of as an excellent example of the rather mean, low origins of writing itself, which we so venerate in accounting. All of our earliest examples of writing are very, very straightforward accounting at first. Clay tablets, you know, or scribblings upon an ostracon, but primarily just to keep records. You know, if you go with Denis Schmandt-Besserat's hypothesis, writing comes out of this Mesopotamian context with clay bullae, you know, enclosures of tokens to commemorate financial transactions, to keep a record of them. Linear B certainly was primarily used for accounting. The Doomsday Book is accounting. You know, how many chickens does whatever monastery actually have? You know, how many goats? How many you know, fruit trees? All of this is commerce and accounting, and you have this idea of mercantilism. So you've got Richard the Lionhearted going off on foreign wars, being buried in France. There's this continental dimension that you brought up. There's this role of the Dutch in the history of Britain that I don't fully understand. I'm familiar with some.
Just to elaborate on that, it's complicated, but not in a way which leads us off in a relevant tangent. So, from England's point of view, the Dutch revolt. First of all, the Dutch have a parallel history in many ways, in the sense that they also try to impose Magna Carta on their monarch. You know, the Runnymede equivalent in 1215 for the Dutch was when the Duchess Mary was forced to accede to a Magna Carta. I believe it was in the year 1478, following the death of her very bellicose father, who lost a series of dramatic wars. So the example there is the same. And when the Dutch revolt occurred, it was very much based on this idea that the King of the Netherlands, or the Lord of the Netherlands, who was also the King of Spain, had attempted to break the spirit of this Magna Carta and the autonomy afforded to these territories. And again, this was the behest of a foreign king who, it's complicated. I mean, Philip II was less foreign to the Dutch than, most of the Plantagenets were to England, because his father, Charles V, was known originally as Charles of Ghent, because he was brought up in Flanders. His mother was, his grandmother was the Mary that I mentioned. There was an explicit connection with the Spanish Habsburgs, to the point that they were known as the House of Burgundy before they were known as the House of Spain, because, of course, the Burgundians controlled the Netherlands, and hence why the lordship of the Netherlands passed to the Habsburgs. But the Dutch severed this link with the monarchy, and when they were involved in their revolt against them. And from 1579, the way to get around this essentially was to try and find someone who would be willing to be a token monarch of the remnant of Dutch territory. It wasn't just for the case of, expediency in terms of we need a warlord to fight the Spanish. It was a means of gaining legitimacy. And it was also a means, you can say, of trying to expand the Dutch state out to encompass all of the Spanish Netherlands, which they failed to achieve. One of these examples was the Duke of Alençon, who at one point would have been a potential contender for the marriage of marriage to Elizabeth herself. Another example, of course, was another potential marriage suitor for Elizabeth, who was Dudley, the Duke of Leicester. So there are many sort of interesting comparisons in the idea that there could have been a Dutch Anglo monarchy at one point during the coalescing of this Dutch nationhood. At the same time, I describe Elizabeth, you can say, almost as the supreme example of this English sovereign monarchy as it should have been, ignoring, of course, my own sort of Catholic preference here. And yet, the Dutch did not coalesce into a monarchy. And so the basis and the continuity of their state became fundamentally opposed to the idea of monarchy. However, Britain had to continue sustaining the impetus of the Dutch revolt and sending its privateers to attack the Spanish because of the fundamental imbalance in power between Britain and its greatest continental rival, which of course was the Empire of Spain. So within all of these considerations, you can say that there should have been a natural alliance between Britain and England and their replicating political systems. But ultimately, the Dutch became a mercantilist republic, and that invariably undermined the Elizabethan settlement in the long term. At first, we tried to go to war with it. That didn't work. And inevitably, we were conquered by it, to the point that the Dutch Republican ideas essentially were embedded into the English Constitution, which is essentially the origin of the Bill of Rights. And again, this was also founded on a formal deposition and usurpation of the authority, not just of James II, but also of the would-be James III, the so-called Old Pretender. So there are a lot of sort of layers in considering Holland, the Netherlands, and its relationship to monarchy in Britain. It could have gone many different ways, but I believe in the end, the results were not just fatal for, genuine monarchy in the Netherlands, but also in Britain. People will point to the irony of all this and say, oh, the Netherlands has a king. Well, yeah, there was the novelty that the first king of the United Netherlands actually tried to rule as a monarchy, but the monarchy of the Netherlands today is even more preposterous and absurd than the monarchy of England. So yeah, a lot of interesting points you can bring up in terms of trying to understand this relationship.
Yeah, the reason and you've sort of moved towards what I was heading towards. The reason I bring it up or brought it up was because you have this idea of mercantilism. Commerce and the way in which the identity of the Dutch is directly tied to seafaring. I think you can very safely say that the identity of the British, the English, and the rest of them. I mean, the sailors actually, manning those ships, hauling on those ropes, scrubbing those decks. They came from all across what's now Britain. So I think you could say the British identity is very deeply tied to the sea and seafaring. But those things were driven in large part, certainly in the beginning. I mean, it goes back to the Hansa as well, and trading in the North Sea and up into the Baltic regions. But this idea of seafaring for trade, I think, is the primary focus, with some Scandi sort of filigree on top of raiding and piracy, certainly. But there's this idea of sailing around the world in order to engage in trade, and a fair amount of piracy as well, just to keep it fun. So commerce, certainly from the development of the great companies, the East India Company, the British and the Dutch ones, commerce is central to the identity of both these nations. And I brought up the Doomsday Book and accounting as another aspect of this. Kings who claim to serve this divine function, but who really just want to fill their treasuries and keep records of everything in order to grasp it more tightly. Again, coming sort of back to this idea of the Doomsday Book and possessions. But what I really wanted to get at, and I'd like to hear your thoughts on, is this idea of mercantilism itself related to this seafaring identity, which I don't think anyone would argue is central to British identity writ large. We have this old idea from Rome that aristocrats and certainly kings were not supposed to be merchants. Now, this was always just an idea because every king had to pay for shit. And so, the person in charge of the treasury would be of great importance to the king. And I guess I'm saying I don't want to make too much of this idea that aristocrats were ever separated from grubbing for money. But in the old days of Rome, as I'm sure you know, if you were of proper gens, you were not supposed to be a merchant. You were not supposed to be a negotiatore. And you were supposed to make your living from the land. And I guess what I'm getting at is it possible to have an actual king if his nation is primarily a mercantile one?
I think it's important to note that how do we essentially distinguish between mercantilism and adventurism? Because I wouldn't necessarily refer to, I don't know, the monarchy of Elizabeth I and James as mercantilist so much as I would basically say it's a privateer economy. Not just a privateer economy in the sense that Francis Drake and Walter Raleigh were out there raiding Spanish treasure ships, but also in the sense that we have the adventurers going out and formally really colonizing Ireland and leading the Ulster Plantationists, etc. The whole idea of Britain, England becoming an empire of commerce doesn't really become established until after 1688. Before the kings, essentially. I mean, just take Charles I as an example. The problem with Charles I is that he was almost incapable of, raising revenue, to the point that when he tried to impose the ship tax, essentially, it was seen as some, completely impeachable offense, despite the fact that Parliament hadn't done its, job of conferring upon him, what was it, tonnage and poundage, which was essentially nothing more than an expected sort of conferment by Parliament up until that point. So this idea is really representative of something that I've been emphasizing a lot on content everywhere else a bit, which is Britain is representing a heterogeneous empire of any empires with a decentralized political structure. And that doesn't really come into the fore, like I said, until after the Glorious Revolution in the 18th century, because the effect of what William of Orange did was to create a aristocracy in England, a pseudo aristocracy in many senses, in terms of those directly relating to the global economy, who would essentially wield real power in the nation, as opposed to the monarchy, who gradually became more irrelevant and nothing more than office holders. The most extreme example, I would say, of this was George I and George II. It's only with George III that a Hanoverian monarch actually tried to assert his own authority within the kingdom by going back to appointing aristocrats and royal favorites, etc., and trying to rein in the sort of free trade impulses of the British Empire by attempting to establish formal royal authority over places in the New World, even though that has been thoroughly sort of exaggerated in terms of his intention to really enforce that. But nevertheless, this idea of decentralization, mercantilism associated with the monarchy, what you're really describing is not the monarch becoming a merchant, but rather merchants displacing the monarchy. And the closest thing you can really say that Britain can relate to in that regard is what happened in Venice, where the Doge essentially was a military figurehead, representative of the great patrician houses and the great council of Florence, but is there basically to pursue the aims of a mercantilist state. And the most extreme example of that, of course, I mean, there are many words and definitions of mercantilism. I don't want to go off on a different tangent, but that really is exemplified with the Fourth Crusade, where the Eastern Roman Empire was courted, literally sort of courted by the Venetians. They took their quarter all across the sort of span of the empire and established a commercial empire there. That sort of relates to this idea of monarchy that you're associating with. And of course, the Doge wasn't a monarch. He was a dukes in the sense that he represented authority, military authority. And the commercialization of the British state, you can say, degenerates our monarchy thus. It simply becomes the authority represented in the state, essentially, to promote the trade and commercial interests of the British Empire. If you don't accept merchants into China, the authority of the crown represented in the Royal Navy will come up and bombard your, coastal fortifications. Do you see what I'm getting at there?
Yes, absolutely. And I often say I would have written a shorter note, except I didn't have time. But listening to you and thinking about what I was trying and failing to succinctly state, it's basically that the proper form of government for any type of truly mercantilist society, leaving aside, as you quite rightly suggest, getting into the weeds with definitions of mercantilism, taking it as generally understood, a mercantilist place, let's call it a place, because when you enter this realm, calling it a nation becomes increasingly difficult. Great trading entrepôts and mixed populations and the rest. The proper form of government from mercantilist place is oligarchy. And so I guess what I'm coming around to is another angle that I think deserves our consideration. Could you even have a king of a mercantilist place? You mentioned on Twitter, and I liked it very much. It was a mordant observation, certainly, but you referred to the current king of your place as the king of Jamaica. Which is it can't be summarized in a more acid way. Is it possible? How could we even have a king of a mercantilist place? And where does that leave us with the idea of a return of a king? How could a king even return to a mercantilist place?
There are two things. First of all, I want to elaborate on what I really meant by King of Jamaica, which is that if I'm going to take the idea of bondage that we brought up, bondsman and subjecthood, seriously, the idea of Jamaica and England on the face of it sharing the same monarch is absurd, and the legacy again of the ad hoc heterogeneous conquest of the British Empire. And they shouldn't be held by one person. Now, some people have also been accusing me of hypocrisy because I talk about the Habsburgs. But the reason I focus on the Habsburgs as an example, because I bring up what Charles V believed essentially was his own mantra when it comes to monarchy, which is the ruler of all is the ruler of each. I.e., one has to preserve the composition, the character, and so all of a sudden, the monarch is able essentially to represent all of the bodies, as it were. You can almost say, in terms of delegating this authority and seeing this in terms of, like the system of councils, that as the monarch is the vice regent of Christ, so all of his possessions in turn become their children. You have to preserve and raise them properly and ensure their own sort of autonomy in a way, but you have to ensure that the family is retained, that you enable all of their human flourishing, and sort of trite observations like that. The monarch of all is the monarch of each, to be father to all. And in the case of Charles V, I would say he achieved that as well as he could, given the immense pressures he was under. Like, despite the fact he was at war with most of Europe throughout his entire reign, he never tried to consolidate even Spain, for example, in a way that kings 200 years later would do. This is problematic if you take another example, which he's a much better example of monarchy than Charles III, but nevertheless it bears consideration, which is Franz Joseph of Austria. Because Franz Joseph of Austria was forced to make many concessions to many of the ethnic groups within his empire, who before him really had enjoyed a historic and symbolic conception of monarchy, not necessarily an ethnic one, because true ethnic nationalism on scale was not really conceived of until the French Revolution. When I talk about monarchy, I'm really talking it in terms of not just a bondage and subjectum, but also a fraternal association, i.e., there are local personal relationships with authorities within places, dukes, rulers, even sort of mayors and figures like that, sheriffs, who are in turn all connected to the monarch, who receives petitions from everyone and arbitrates between these different groups. But in the case of grand scale nationalism, there is a degree of homogeneity, which, if anything, means that the relationship to the monarch becomes more essential, because the intermediaries, those particularisms, all of a sudden fall away, and you are left essentially with nothing other than the ethnarch, the national head. So how can you take this with someone like Franz Josef, who was the national head of, just within the nations actually contained within the Austrian Empire, we're talking about at least half a dozen who also have territory which they share and has never had some sort of grandiose ethnic conception to it, like Bohemia, Moravia, which is modern-day Czechia. Well, you inevitably piss off some of the people you're supposed to be loyal to and have to favor others. There was a famous scandal where one of the prime ministers he brought in to administer Bohemia and Moravia tried to force all the civil servants to be bilingual, which inevitably meant that all of the German civil servants were disenfranchised, and all of the Czech ones were empowered, because of course the Czechs had to be bilingual because they operated essentially in a German-dominated hierarchy. Those little things again just indicate why figures like Schonerer and Adolf Hitler believed that the Habsburgs represented the dispossession of ethnos, and there needed to be some sort of grand reckoning in terms of the realization of a new national community, i.e., conceiving of a body politic dispossessed of all of these figures who were stymieing the flourishing of the nation. And you have to radically reconceive of this whole notion. So that is all the implications you have to consider when thinking, how can you connect and rule over all of these disparate territories which seem to be fundamentally at odds to each other? And what is worse, when I mentioned the example of the King of Jamaica and the King of England, is that Jamaica being imported into England means that ethnic and territorial frictions that didn't exist before now do exist. Is the king supposed to represent the rights of Jamaicans within England or vice versa? I think if you think of the possibility of protecting the rights of white people in Jamaica versus the rights of Jamaicans in England, you obviously know what the preference would be. My example with Rhodesia, sort of seriously, um, uh, highlighting that example. And how did the Rhodesians respond when they felt that the monarch was being so overtly preferential, not just towards a certain group within their land, but also foreigners who no longer represented subjectdom, but rather this tenuous link to the Commonwealth? They had to abolish the monarchy. They had to burn their Bibles because the Archbishop of Canterbury was telling you to shoot their kith and kin in terms of fighting racism. All of these sacred objects, which are associated with the mystical body of kingship, become so repellent that you become revolutionaries, not because you detest the ideas, but because you love them. It's one of the most grueling things that, the opposite of, the coin of love, of course, the inverse is hate. And that's essentially what it becomes when you look at figures who have been dispossessed. In a way, you can say that many people, in the example of the French Revolution, also felt a similar sense of dispossession. But coming back to your commercial example, because these seem very disparate things, but you're brought up in the post that I made originally. The way that monarchs got around it in the medieval period was to territorialize and particularize their states, i.e., take England. We won't turn it into a merchant republic, but rather we will make the city of London autonomous within England and confer on it certain merchant rights. I am the Holy Roman Emperor. I understand that I need taxes, revenue, investment in order to fight my wars against foreign enemies, or to sponsor a crusade. So I am going to confer specific rights and, importantly, immediacy upon certain cities within the north and all across the empire, and these become imperial and free cities. So there is a way historically where you can create a relationship with merchants, but merchants in a way which are very much confined to certain jurisdictions, and that have a direct relationship and accountability to the monarch in the way that a monarch is no longer beholden to them, but all of their rights can be bestowed. But like with Magna Carta, they can also be rescinded should they be violating, you can say, the fundamental precepts of monarchy. So this idea of the city contained as an entity and enjoying immediacy is the way historically that monarchs have had to try and cope with this idea of commercialism, this idea of direct relationships. And of course, the other way that monarchs got around this was by establishing a direct relationship with a certain ethnic group. And in a similar way, where if city-states abused their privileges, monarchs who thought that the Jews, in this case, obviously, were abusing their relationship, would simply dissolve them and banish them, as was the case many times in European history. And in the case of England, was the case for over 300 years.
It's interesting. You've partially answered and perhaps anticipated a question that I'll turn to in just a second. Before I do so, I want to just underscore, with this example of attempting to teach, to force Austrian imperial state functionaries to master more than one language. It's can't remember if it's the War of 1866 that is the clear example, but at West Point, one of the examples that's used when teaching officers is the importance of sharing a language. And as I said, I can't remember if it's the War of 1866 or however many weeks that went on. But one of the examples taught at West Point is the Austrians fighting the Prussians, and the Austrians attempting to, deal with an officer class that couldn't always speak the language of the troops that they were commanding. And what a train wreck all of that was, compared to the Prussians, who were, first off, had a famously competent officer class, but who could also speak the same language and communicate with each other. And that's just another one of these problems that happens with the more imperial flavor.
Well, again, with the monikers, the monarch of all as the monarch of each, the only way to cope with that is by having several armies, and not to basically force them to come under arms for fights that are not in their interest. And of course, when you're having to consolidate and centralize these, things that have never even occurred to people, the idea of forcing Hungarians and Poles and Czechs and Croats and Serbs all into one army, which was a relatively recent thing in the grand scheme. All of these ideas of the monarch of all as the monarch of each, and one has to be sensitive to all of the particular interests. I mean, it all sort of goes out the window, doesn't it?
Yes, entirely. Which brings us around to the question that I was going to ask, which you sort of partially answered, with your example of creating, free cities of various kinds, and all the aspects, interestingly, of the middle class, the Burgermeister bourgeois, that come with that. But I guess the explicit way to frame this question, and in asking it, I'll be, you'll be pushed to return to something you already covered, but I just want to ask it more explicitly for the record and see if it teases out any further details. But would you say that a king, properly construed, therefore must be, in some sense, an ethnarch?
I do believe that, because it buttresses all of the points that you and I have been making throughout the stream, which is the idea of bond, the idea of the ring, and the idea of marriage. And the reason why I bring up Elizabeth I as such an example, and why I contrast that with the potential sort of nightmare from a Henry V example of France dominating England. There has to be a connection with a people in order to establish that familial connection and that idea of reciprocal relationships. Because, going all the way back to King David and the monarchical examples, one can bring up again and again, the monarch is a patriarch, and you can't have a father without a family, essentially. And you can adopt a few children, essentially, but you can't again have a family which is purely consistent of adopted children who don't even speak the same language. It becomes a farce. So in a sense, yes, I do believe that the monarch has to be an ethnarch. The monarch has to have some claim or connection. And when it comes to someone like Charles V, there was a connection, albeit spurious, because he was still the dynastic inheritor of all of these territories. Austria came into these territories by inheritance and marriage, not via conquest. So restoring this idea, and this is directly associated with the idea of restoration. The return of the king is explicitly made with the association that a king has to be an ethnarch, because the situation we have at the moment that has generated the conditions for this talk even happening is that the king does not represent any ethnic connection. He represents a form of institutional fetishism, which, as I've said earlier, is actually a mockery of everything relating to kingship and, perversion of, you can say, idolatrous, second-hand Catholic associations and all of these sort of things. because the bond, the warband, the tribe, at its sort of most basic level, that is what the monarch is. The monarch is sovereign over a realm, essentially. He is priest among that dominion, and all of the regions and the cities, etc., represent some form of, delegation of that. Brothers, sons, personal relationships with nobility, etc., and the monarch being able to arbitrate over all of this. As we've been at pains to mention the idea of the body politic, the sort of supreme function of sort of temporal kingship is the administration of justice and access and arbitration. And thereby the king needs to feel a sense of genuine protectorship and the desire to exact justice on behalf of all of his subjects, high and low. And if you remove the subject status, if you remove the ethnarch component of that, you arrive at the situation where we have in Britain today, where a king is applauding the acts of a Labour government to imprison native political prisoners to defend the rights of what are essentially Bashi bazooks.
Yeah, Bashabazook. For those who don't know, it means crazy head, and what AM is referring to here in the Turkish, Bush means head. Bashabazook means broken head. Actually, they're just intemperate raiders sent across borders as irregulars to create absolute chaos. I think that's a very well chosen comparison. They're generally known for rape and plunder and murder. Just absolute chaos. They served the Ottomans in that regard. Yes, and that's one of the striking tragedies of what we see unfolding in Britain at the moment. And there is this very much this sense. I feel anyway, witnessing it to whatever extent I can, in media. There's this sense of betrayal on the part of these people who are coming out and saying no and waving English flags. It's just, I think there's a deep-seated kind of shock. Once upon a time, you would have been able to insulate the king from the people in some respect, at least in reference to things like this, where they would think to themselves, oh, there are just ministers who are standing in the way. The king doesn't know. But if the king knew, if we could just get word to the king and he could hear our case, he would understand our position and that we are his loyal subjects. And yet what we see here is him looking down upon it, while appointing, the first black head of the household kitchens or whatever. He's looking down upon it and saying, yes, this is good and how it should be. So I guess this brings
just to quickly substantiate that before we move on, because a very interesting point you bring up here. If there is some sort of problem on the surface, the monarchist never accuses the monarch; they always accuse the bad advisors. And one of the issues with absolute monarchy is the removal of the right of petition, and the right of petition is fundamental to my understanding of right monarchy, because it's the idea of accessibility to all of your subjects, high and low, and why demographic explosion and politics of mass really sort of undermines this idea. If you take that and the logical implications of absolutism, the king becomes a prisoner of his own managerial construct. And indeed, part of the whole basis of absolute monarchy, this managerialism, is almost to imprison the king within a construct of ritual. That was the case with Philip IV. He is the son. He is what gives legitimacy to the institutions. But as the institutions become increasingly corrupt, the king is seen as captive. Either the king needs to be liberated, or in the worst example, if the king is actively sort of asserting these policies, if the king has agency in a way where he is no longer captive, the king automatically ceases to become king and he becomes a tyrant. And I do mean this sort of tyrant in a true sort of Aristotelian sense, in the sense that he is often a foreign imposition ruling simply from the top down with no mechanisms of redress, as we very much see with our system at the moment, and finds comfort in the company of foreigners.
Yes. Yes. The tyrant itself, really, in its original sense, as you say, among the Greeks, it's this idea of a king or a central ruler who has no roots. That's really the idea, that there's no roots, there's no connection to the people, no mechanism for redress, as you say. And it does increasingly seem as though that's the case everywhere. Where everywhere some vestigial king remains, I think many of them simply, on the one hand, know what side their bread is buttered on. And at the same time, I think they also recognize that if they were to do otherwise, they would be removed and replaced. So, yeah, the prospects don't seem good for kings in the immediate future. But if one were to imagine a contemporary return of a king to Britain, are there any scenarios under which that would be conceivable? And what kind of people would we be talking about in the framework of any of these conceivable scenarios?
Well, it's interesting you brought this up as you wanted me to sort of come to you with like a a list of possible contenders for this. Um, the first, of course, is actually to look down the uh, legal right of succession to the British throne, and I think you can comfortably say that going down virtually all of them, you'll be hard pressed to find anyone who will in any way act differently to the current king. I think the problem with the current king vis-a-vis anyone sort of, even William, who is the Prince of Wales, is that the current king is a active proponent and cheerleader over things which run completely contrary to the interests of the population of England in particular, like his rampant sort of climate alarmism, his patronage of the Commonwealth, his ideas of wealth redistribution, and the more utterances he makes, which seem to be incredibly sort of aligned with that of his government. It's not just a matter of the king possessing his government, but also the king actively sort of agreeing with their policies. And I'm reminded of another quote by Franz Josef, which is, "My duty as a monarch of the old school is to spare my people from their governments," essentially. In other words, the governments are there to be dismissed at whim if the monarch essentially finds them to be acting contrary to the will of his peoples, in the case of Austria, because, of course, he was the ruler of many nations, not just one. But in the case of Charles, we don't have to just think of Starmer. We have to think of Jacinda Ardern. We have to think of Justin Trudeau. We have to think of I forget who the Prime Minister of Australia is, but not really any better. And think that
About to
Charles,
say, probably best not to remember him or her. Yeah.
yeah, it's a him. I can't remember his name, but yeah, that just further cements my point that the role of a monarch essentially is to redress all of these issues. So I think Charles in many ways is worse. But going down the list of succession, um, of course, I will admit, to having a penchant towards, Catholicism. Now, given the situation with Camilla Parker Bowles, the situation with Catholicism is confused, to say the least, in terms of what actual implication there would be. Albanese, thank you, Nail looking for a hammer. And the first one will be Lord Downpatrick, but he certainly isn't a serious contender. So I have to sort of go down and actually look at Nicholas Windsor, who is the son of the Duke of Kent. And the reason I come up with him as, possibly the only the only person on the list of the first sort of 100 people in the line of succession, is because he is the patron of the Society of King Charles the Martyr, which venerates King Charles and his deposition as essentially a formal martyrdom, in the sense that he has become an Anglican and also a pseudo-Catholic saint. And I think there's no sort of greater expression than sort of belief in true monarchy and sort of anti-modernism than being the patron of the Society of King Charles the Martyr. Indeed, I spent a large chunk of time a couple of years ago focusing on this very topic. So it's quite interesting that such a figure actually has a claim to the throne. So that's one example, if you want to comment on that.
Oh, I don't even know enough about the details of any of this, or of the persons involved. Presumably, it should be taken as a given that none of these people have a snowball's chance in hell of becoming.
Well, no, I'm just
right?
coming. I'm just. The whole idea is what.
Yeah, you're indulging my. Yeah, you're indulging
we're
whatever.
we're indulging the actual practicalities of this, and I'm going from all sort of means. So that is one example. The man who hails the icon basilicae. The mirror to the king. As and focuses on the church and royalism and piety. I just find it, considering how I don't know, morally and intellectually vacuous or even bankrupt so many members of the royal family are. I find Nicholas Windsor to be a sort of refreshing breath of fresh air. Then we're going on to the Jacobite succession. Interestingly, we haven't brought up Jacobitism really at all, apart from my reference to the Old Pretender. But Jacobitism in this context I use as a contrary example to what happened with the Dutch coup in 1688, focusing on this idea of usurpation, the idea of Parliament demolishing a king, which, given the fact that Parliament is really there as the institution and, part of the corporation of England bequeathed to by the monarch, I find that whole sort of notion completely repugnant, that Parliament is the body and not the king, rather than the king working through Parliament as crown in Parliament. So all of these ideas, which are offensive to monarchist sensibilities, are sort of identified with the Dutch coup in 1688. And made worse by the fact that then you import Hanoverians to sit on the throne just to acquiesce to the new Whig settlement and domination. The very origin of prime minister, of non-royal government, essentially, but government derived from parliamentarianism, is as a result of the exclusion of the sort of rightful successors to the throne, thanks to the Dutch coup. Which is why there is so much focus, and indeed Jacobitism was so much of an issue in the first half of the 18th century. But when Bonnie Prince Charlie was sort of defeated in the 1740s, it really became more of a romantic affectation to be a Jacobite, especially the fact that Bonnie Prince Charlie would swear the oath, accept Anglican communion, and was a Freemason. That in itself created an indelible dent on his legacy as some sort of Arthurian archetype. If we're going down this, except from a king from Wales, he would be the lion descending from Scotland to slay the sort of the Hanoverian usurpers. So there's that aspect of it, and the continuity of this legacy, which again is also a Catholic legacy, has found itself on the shoulders of one Francis von Bayern, of Wittelsbach, the monarchy in or former monarchy in Bavaria. According to the sort of Jacobite line of succession, this man would be Francis II. And the reason I think as little of Francis II as I do of Charles is because he is a Catholic in name only. He is sort of openly gay. The interests he does have essentially are in sort of modern art, but he is the founder of a network called the Nymphenburg sort of operation or talks, which Nymphenburg, obviously, from the Bavarian royal palace, where he lives, interestingly, still today, despite the fact that the Bavarian monarchy was abolished. And it is a platform for interfaith and multicultural dialogue. So again, there is very little which sort of merits connection with the Jacobite claimant as with the current House of Windsor. But going further down that line, I mentioned the whole thing which started your interest in this idea was my comment about the Prince of Liechtenstein landing on the shores of Dover. The reason I mention that is because his niece, who is the third in line for the Jacobite claimant, but also very likely to be the Jacobite claimant too, because her father is 87 and Francis is 91. She is the wife of the Prince of Liechtenstein, or the former Prince of Liechtenstein. And the whole sort of house of Liechtenstein is really the only example in Europe of having so much as you can say real monarchy, albeit it's sort of libertarian maxing, if that makes sense. This is Princess Sophie, who is the spouse of Prince Alois, who is the son of Hans Adam II, which is sort of the incarnation of what I'm talking about. But like I said, to take this and to actually turn this into a political program for restoration of monarchy in England, all of these things are purely academic, including the contender of his Hans Adam's grandson, who was roughly my age, because until a Jacobite claimant asserts a claim to the throne, like the last Jacobite claimant to assert a real claim to the throne was Henry IX, the Cardinal King, who was the brother of Bonnie Prince Charlie, and he died around the year 1800, after which, like I said, Jacobitism had a romantic kitsch to it. Until any of these people, claim the throne for themselves and begin advocating for the positions I am, and the whole sort of litany of possible sort of angles you can take the usurpation, all of this becomes academic. So instead, one has to broaden one's horizons and not just be, I don't know, a naive, Stuart royalist or whatever, and say that really, I think all it would take in terms of trying to appeal to noble blood is having anyone who is a descendant of Cerdic. All of the monarchs of Britain are matrilineal descendants of Cerdic, who was the first king of Wessex. There are no sort of patrilineal lineages, and that's why the House of England or the House of Great Britain keeps changing from, Plantagenet to Tudor, from Tudor to Stuart, from Stuart to Hanoverian, from Hanoverian to Saxe-Coburg, and really the current House of England today isn't House of Windsor, because that's purely monarch by confectioners, rather the house is the House of Holstein, Gottorp, Glucksburg, Sonderburg. If I'm going to be pedantic about what
Glucksburg is a infelicitous name.
that is the actual ruling house of Great Britain at this time. That also, in many ways, again underlines this idea of usurpation. That if anyone, who is a descendant of Cerdic can claim the throne, then really, it's up for the taking. Really, all you have to do is have some sort of noble lineage to give your claim a tinsy-wincy bit of legitimacy. The other idea is to completely dispense with royal lines entirely. And I would almost say that this is, I would call it a Clovician situation. I'm sure other people would draw more sort of 20th century comparisons to what I'm talking about. But Clovis was ultimately the final nail in the coffin for the Western Roman Empire. He was the one who defeated the kingdom of Soissons, deposed Syagrius, and was the first king of the Franks. All Clovis was a warlord who had inherited a sort of petty domain from his father Chilperic. And yet Clovis was able to form, on the sort of the foundations of what the Romans left, a sacerdotal kingdom, which then a few centuries later would carry on the legacy of the Roman Empire in the West through his successor Charlemagne. So in other words, a random Salian Frank warlord who just inhabited the similar territory was able to act as the forerunner for a dynasty which will create the modern boundaries of France and the Holy Roman Empire. Now, the reason I find this idea very interesting essentially is that, it opens up for infinite numbers of potential possibilities, and also ways of intellectually interpreting what monarchy is, because there has been so little in the way of sort of genuine sort of revolutionary upheaval in this country. Now that conservatism is dead and, constitutionalism has basically been, jettisoned as we speak. So, for example, um, their current constitutional reforms going to completely and utterly, invalidate the House of Lords. These people don't care about anything relating to any of these ideas. In fact, they are completely and utterly opposed to it and would like to lock me up for suggesting these ideas. But all of this is to say that what political traditions exist in this country need to essentially be reworked from the ground up. And so taking this idea of Clovis as an originator of essentially anything can happen, any amalgamation, any new institutions, anyone can take the throne. What matters is the restoration of this higher quality of the sacerdotal aspect of kingship. It doesn't even have to be called a king. The idea of referring to one as King Rex, I mean, even Arthur, the idea of Arthur as King Arthur was an invention of Geoffrey of Monmouth, who was writing 600 years after the fact. References to Arthur before, I think in the example of Nennius, referred to him as a duke. And what is a duke really, but ultimately someone who wields authority? It is a figure representing command, if nothing else, in the same way that imperator represents command, represents authority, and the idea of a prince, a princeps, represents first among equals. The princeps is the first. So it doesn't matter what title you associate with this, but if you take all of these terms and apply it in fact to a figure who embodies monarchy in a truer sense, so long as you're able essentially to represent, imperium, ducal authority over an ethnic cohort, over a defined territory, it is from that basis that you recreate the institutions. When you've recreated the institutions, you are creating the realm, the state, the body politic, and indeed the law. So I think we're basically at the situation again, given how horrifying things are at this point, that in order to arrive at a true sort of Arthurian example, there almost has to be a Rousseauian-esque repudiation of all of these manifestations, legal and symbolic, and even demographic, of this usurpation. And I find this idea very interesting, and really it's sort of looking at history and seeing how these ideas will manifest. And as in the case of King Arthur, going back to this archetype, what is sort of the political philosopher or the sort of the people advocating for this, but other than like a modern day Merlin, effectively trying to counsel the monarch and conceive of this new realm and body politic of possibilities. And so that's really all I can sort of add in terms of leading to this. All I can say is point to these examples and point to the example of Clovis and say that what really needs to be imagined is a new bond, is a new community, is the ability to petition. Once you have a leader, essentially, who is able to connect and to represent, importantly, all of these things, then you have de facto created a king.
And all it takes is the hard circumstances that give rise to strong men for such a person to come to the fore. And we're certainly watching an ever accelerating descent into circumstances so bad that it becomes less difficult to imagine the emergence of someone like that. I mean, who knows? In 10 years, we could have, a Grand Duke and warlord Paddy Pimblett being advised by Morgoth as Merlin, and yeah, we could have a new war leader in Britain who, unfortunately, the very nature of that, all joking aside, is such that it's going to have to get very, very much worse before it gets better. That seems to be
as I bring up my Clovis example, that is taking part amidst the complete and utter collapse of the Roman Empire in the West. So in order for things to essentially, and in terms of, again, the restoration, if we're going to look at the coronation of Charlemagne as the restoration, the return of the emperor, Majorian is murdered by Ricimer, and the whole sense of Romanitas in the West is lost. How long does that process take in order to arrive at Charlemagne? Charlemagne, who is in many ways, you can say, the Emperor Majorian realized as the king under the mountain, and again, come back to Christ-like affectations, the Lamb of God, the Lamb who was slain, who was put away, entombed, leads the harrowing of hell, resurrects the dead, and is in turn resurrected on this earthly plane, and his kingdom shall have no end. We're talking eschatological phenomena here. We're talking about something which is deeply spiritual, and something which has sort of been attempted to be replicated, transmuted in a way in terms of conceiving of temporal leadership. That was very much the case in terms of trying to create an iconography around Charlemagne, because he was supposed to embody all of this. But like I said, it took hundreds of years to arrive at a warlord holding on to the vestiges of something regarding these ideas, and a man to actually realize a form of restoration. And this is also a demographic question, because all of these things involve massive demographic and linguistic change across the West. Whether that is going to play a role in all of this idea, in terms of either a restoration of sort of a demographic legacy or integration, I don't know. Whether a new nation will be formed, as indeed England was formed on the basis of Britain, I don't know. But the point is that all of these historical examples exist, and this is based on the idea of the loss of the body, the usurpation, even the death, but then the prospect of the restoration and the resurrection akin to Christ.
Yeah, that would, as dark as the path through that to the other side would or will doubtless be, it seems preferable to something that was sort of brought up in the comments. Two different people's comments made at different times, but they kind of go together. One was the idea, a parallel was drawn between the idea of having to combat the alien Danelaw and the arrival of Sharia, and the other one was, could it still be considered a king if it's a sultan in Britain? Which are, obviously it was joking, but it's a rather dark picture. I think I'm going to sit now and listen to Black Sabbath in the dark alone and cut myself.
No, I'm taking the idea seriously, because it's something that has occurred to me as well. That has happened in Europe. It's happened several times. Obviously, it's happened in the case of the Ottomans. It also happened in the case of Spain, and it happened in the case of Russia. But even in the case of the Ottomans, as you know, with the millet system, the Ottoman Sultan had to establish a form of the ruler of all as the ruler of each. he had to establish himself as the inheritor of the Imperium of Rome, of the Romans. He had to establish the Roman nation, which was founded around a ideological and, ethnic core, Greeks. And indeed, who was the head of that? A man called an ethnarch. So historically, there have been examples of, benevolent sultans very sparingly when it comes to the realities of actually having to deal with, the Devasherme, and having to deal with irregulars and constant warfare and, land sieges and all the rest. But that is one historical example. The reason I don't think that's going to happen is because let's just say that, weirdly enough, the Islam of the Caliphs of Cordoba and the sultans of Turkey, the Ottoman padishahs, uh, in some ways are more sophisticated than the Islam that's been brought over in Britain today. Let me just let me just emphasize that. We're not talking about sort of sophisticated attempts to sort of establish a intricate system of canon law, secular law, and try to balance this with Islamic jurisprudence. I don't see that at all happening in the current context that we have. Perhaps a better example then is to look at what happened in Russia, whereby there is essentially a hostile Islamic and sort of foreign nucleus in the form of the Golden Horde, which will leave you alone so much as you're basically able to extract tribute from everyone else. But because of the creation of something like that, a massive sort of tributary sort of nomadic, semi-nomadic Islamic empire operating on some of your territory, that actually breeds the creation of something else which is established in its opposition, as we saw with Dmitry Donskoy when he attempted to repel the Golden Horde in the end of the 14th century. And that led to the creation of Russia, as we know it today, from the state of Muscovy. So establishing nations within nations can also be ways to incentivize this accelerated process of kingship. Because, from Russia, for example, the grand princes of Kiev and the grand princes of Novgorod and Vladimir are degenerated into this position essentially of exalted subjecthood. And then they rise again to form into this messianic conception of the Tsar. That in itself is not just a process of restoration, but it's also a process of aggrandizement. So you have to consider all of these historic possibilities.
Yeah, I think that's a very nice closing metaphor. The idea of the grain of the sand in the oyster shell. That gives rise eventually to the pearl through the irritation it creates, if that's not too far-fetched a comparison. Are there any other thoughts that you would want to cover that you did not have a chance to do?
No, I think hopefully we've covered this topic, because again, it's a very sort of metaphysical stream. We're not we're not sort of promoting anything sort of really practical, but I think in terms of getting the metaphysics across, I think we've exhausted this topic, I think.
Well, it certainly hasn't exhausted me. It's been a bracing recharge because so much of this geopolitical stuff is it seems like it puts me in mind of that old thing for videos of Morgoth that he used to open, where he showed this footage of this man in some sort of biological protective suit, descending into filth. And this is a welcome break from that, just to consider this background, and I suppose the properly bracing closing thought would be, someone said it in the chat, have a bit of faith. I think it was Caravaggio, I can't remember, but the basic idea is, providence is a thing that is unavoidable, and it is in the hands, as it were, of Providence at this point, because it's certainly not in my hands.
Well, there are some more things you can perhaps bring up. Now you've indulged me. The implications regarding Providence are, for me, rather conflicted, because obviously I'm bringing back, the Christ-like illusion, and my preference for this, even though it's not objective, of course, is the monarch as anointed sovereign, not the monarch as simple warband chief, and also the monarch as warband chief, the warband chief essentially who establishes other contrary warband chiefs, and you have a series of quote-unquote monarchies, but all it is essentially represents the state of nature, i.e. Providence being established for the nation. And I think of two examples. I think of Napoleon, and I also think of Hitler. And I think in the case of, say, for example, Napoleon, the idea of he who saves a nation violates no law can itself become a very destructive and self-defeating process, especially when you look at ultimately what Napoleon achieved to France. France was significantly weaker in 1815 than it had been in 1789, despite all of Napoleon's grand pretensions. And that was because, again, of his belief, again, that being connected with France as he was ultimately made him infallible. And that is, again, another essence of Providence willing some sort of democratic emerging of the hero as king can be deliverance, but can also represent another form of doom. However, another thing is, in terms of your idea of things having to get much worse before they get better, that is also necessary, because all of these facets you are mentioning involve divesting the idea of monarchy away from commerce. We are completely dominated by commerce, to the point that in this country in particular, there's almost no industry left. I don't even understand how our economy is functioning, given how no one really makes things anymore. There's barely any manufacturing sector, and what energy we have is also being made thoroughly uncompetitive as well. Everything seems to be, smoke and mirrors, created in corridors in London. And that has to change in order for any of these concepts to bear fruit. And I bring up the example of Rhodesia again, just having that there, because the process of unilateral independence made many Rhodesians into natural aristocrats. I even brought up the example of Ian Smith following on in this sort of aristocratic archetype, which is the soldier farmer. And in many ways, I also look at Robert E. Lee as the American equivalent of the natural sort of planter aristocrat.
Right, like a Cincinnatus.
Well, I wouldn't know, but Washington was very much conceived of as the Cincinnatus. But I'm looking at this more broadly, in the sense of you need men of the land and men of the sword to be aristocrats, in the same way that a monarch is ultimately the princeps and being the first among these aristocrats at some level, and creating a bond between these men. Again, the idea of warlord and warband. This class basically doesn't exist anymore across the West. And in order for this idea to come back, it needs to exist again. And I think the only way it can exist again is if things become much, much worse, which unfortunately I predict they will. So yeah, I'll leave everyone off on that very, very depressing note.
Yes. Well, yes. I should say thank you very much. Excellent conversation. Very happy to have you on again. I hope that everyone will open a little window now on your phone or on your computer, whatever you're listening to this through. Go to Apostolic Majesty's channel on YouTube. Sign up there. There are links, by the way, in the description box down below. I believe I included his Twitter and his YouTube links. Please use them. And you don't, at this point, AM, have a Substack, do you?
No, I don't bother with Substack. I mean, I probably should, but I mean, it really doesn't make any difference because for some bizarre reason, despite my voice being incredibly soporific and sleep inducing, people prefer it when I read things as opposed to just write things. So I haven't felt the need to do a Substack, but thank you for those shills, Semigog. It really does mean quite a lot, even though I'm not really interested.
It means quite a lot. it means so much. Yes, indeed. Well, it's my pleasure, as you know. It's quite genuine.
I'm not trying to belittle it or anything, or just being sarcastic, or I'm just sort of naturally flitting into the AA mode in terms of trying to try to appreciate these sort of things as if I'm working on autopilot. I am being genuine, but thank you.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's my pleasure. And is there anything else that you want to shill? Anything's coming up, any events or anything like that?
I will be in Coventry in a couple of days, but I'm sure any one of you who is going to that event has already booked, and there probably won't be any more tickets available. But to those of you who are going to that, it'll be interesting to actually meet some of you in person for the first time. So no, just thank you very much for having me on again.
Very good. Well, it's my pleasure, sir. Very much my pleasure. Thank you all for listening. And I'll be back before too long with some new material. I, for my part, am doing things on Substack, but I don't know that people on YouTube at this point are really aware of it. So I think what I'm probably going to do is pull some of that material and just read it on streams and see if I myself can put people to sleep with my voice. Thank you all, one and all, again, for being here. Until next time, I am Semiagog, and I am out.